Hi, I'm Brett and welcome to the latest edition of Random Book Talk. I'm pleased to have in the studio today the best-selling and award-winning author of Vietnam and Kokoda and his latest book, Sandakan, Paul Ham. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Brett.
The story of Sandakan, I hope I'm saying that correctly, is one of the most remarkable stories, I think one of the most remarkable I've read about the Second World War. The horrors that you detail are almost unimaginable, but I'd argue it's also one of the least known stories that comes out of the war in the Pacific. What actually happened at Sandakan?
Well, it certainly was one of the most chilling stories to emerge from the Pacific War, and certainly a very harrowing story to write. It has been a little-known story for so long, partly because after the war it was effectively censored. No one could talk about it. The few who returned were obliged to sign muzzling orders. They couldn't talk about it to anybody. But lately, in the last 20 years or so, we've seen the story slowly emerge. What actually happened there is, as you say, almost unimaginable in its horror. At the fall of Singapore, some 50,000 Australian and British prisoners of war were rounded up, and they were herded into Changi, effectively. That was a central prison camp. And then groups of them were sent off to corners of the Japanese Empire. Almost 2,500 were sent to Sandakan, a town on the east coast of Borneo. And there they were set to work to build an airfield. And over the next 3 years, from 1942 to the end of 44, early 45, almost half of them died from disease, hunger, malnutrition, terrible torture, and the way they were treated was absolutely shocking. But the residual number alive, there were some, more than 1,000, were force-marched. Most of them were sent on this death march, as it's become known. There were 3 death marches over Borneo into the heart of the island, basically into the darkness. This island is virgin jungle. And these men were sick and malnourished after 3 years of torment at the hands of the Japanese. This book tells their story and what happens to these men. It
is the most remarkably detailed account, I imagine, of these marches. And you mentioned that most perished. How many survived?
Well, in 1943, the officers were separated from the ordinary soldiers and the non-commissioned officers, and they were sent to Kuching. And there were almost 200 of them. So they survived, and many of them survived. But in terms of those who were sent on the death marches, which is in 1945, of the more than 1,000 sent into Borneo, only 6 came home.
Right.
The rest were slowly exterminated. Now they were killed in various ways, and when they collapsed, they were shot or clubbed to death. They were of no further use to the Japanese as porters, as carriers, and this went on for 6 months or so.
Right. So only 6, and I believe they were all Australians.
The 6 who survived were all Australians. That's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And the marches continued even after the war had officially ended.
There were a number were shot 2 weeks after the armistice, on the 27th of August. These were officers. They believed they were being taken to Jesselton, to the town on the west coast, now Kota Kinabalu. In fact, they were taken to a clearing and shot. It was just the Japanese just were going to get rid of every last trace of evidence of what they had done here. The enormity of what happened emerged after the war, because we did have these 6 survivors, who 3 of whom attended the war crimes tribunals and gave evidence against their former persecutors.
Wow, yeah. You open this book, and I'm holding a copy in my hand, it's a beautiful looking book. You open it with a letter to the Emperor of Japan. That's a fairly provocative thing to do. Can you explain, I guess, a little bit of your motivation for including this letter and what the letter is actually asking of the Emperor of Japan?
I wrote this book, Sandakan, talking to many of the families of the victims. So this is living history. Is around us. Many of us know the Japanese nation through electrical appliances, through sushi, through tourism, through our shared memory of the war, through wonderful visits to what is a great country. Very few Japanese people know what happened here. Very few Japanese people know the extent of the Pacific War and the atrocities committed by the Japanese military regime. It's just simply not taught in Japanese schools. Now, this living history has to be brought to the attention of, I believe, the Japanese nation. When I say that, I mean the government, particularly the emperor, because he is, after all, the highest moral authority in Japan. As to the request for an apology, I mean, I'm a skeptic when it comes to apologies. What do they achieve, really? But especially for families who have lost their
So that's
sons.
the motivation of the letter? It is actually asking
It is
for
actually
an apology?
asking for an apology and a recognition that this occurred.
Right.
And that this is coming from the highest moral authority in Japan. Up until now, we've received piecemeal, I wouldn't call them apologies or even recognitions, but we've had piecemeal sort of acknowledgements that awful things happened in the Pacific War, but it's usually followed up with the qualifier that all sides committed atrocities. Now, that may be true, but it's sort of relativist morality, which doesn't really apply here. I think there are absolutes in the realm of human cruelty, and this is certainly an absolute example. And it is therefore an appeal, really, to the Japanese people, in the person of the emperor, to acknowledge this atrocity, because it is an atrocity. 2,500 men, most of whom were exterminated slowly. They were forced marched, they were tortured, they were starved to death, they received no medical aid for obvious terrible diseases, and this went on and on for 3 years. Now, I think that it is beholden on the Japanese government to acknowledge this. I think that that history is living, and we need to address it. We need to address the repercussions of it. These things don't just happen. Wars don't just occur. They're declared by men, usually men. They are declared and executed by small groups of powerful people, and terrible things happen, as we see in this book in Borneo.
You managed to get the balance right, though. I mean, there are a lot of atrocities, and the history is confronting in that respect in reading the book, but there are also some incredible personal stories of bravery. There are a number of Australian soldiers who, quite ingeniously resisted the Japanese, and I really enjoyed reading those stories. There's one particular story. I think it's Colonel Matthews.
Captain
Lionel Matthews, sorry. And his endurance in the face of weeks of torture I found almost superhuman. How do you explain this level of courage and bravery?
Matthews, his case is almost inexplicable. I've never, in all my writing about war and men at war, I've never come across such sustained courage and resilience. We have to understand what this man and his colleagues did. They set up an underground system within the prison. In other words, they were assisted by civilians on the outside who were helping them to smuggle in medical aid, food, supplies to the prisoners. This was going on for months and months and months. And they built a radio, an underground radio.
It was almost a Hogan's Heroes kind of enterprise.
There was an element of Hogan's Heroes, and it's a relief for the reader to come across this, because they see the Australians developing this incredible underground system, and it had great comic moments as well when the radio receiver was drawing on a power supply which was set up. They made the camp's power supply surge at night so they could sort of stream off the extra voltage. These things were going on for months, and then it was blown. They were deceived by a civilian who blew their cover, and they were arrested. These were not just Australian prisoners, they were also civilians on the outside, very brave men and women who were helping the prisoners. Yeah. And Matthews was amongst them, and a number of other extraordinarily courageous Australian soldiers, particularly Rod Wells, who was a sort of prodigious electronics whiz, and he was the guy who developed, with other soldiers, the radio system. And they were tortured to within an inch of their lives over weeks by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, both in Sandakan and in Kuching. The tortures involved the most hideous forms imaginable. The water torture was just one of them. I won't go into it in detail, but it just beggars belief when you read
that they were able to hold those secrets,
to resist this and hold the secrets. And the secrets were, of course, other men's names who was involved in the smuggling ring. To divulge them would have threatened the lives of a number of people, both prisoners and civilians on the outside. So these guys, I'm talking about Rod Wells, I'm talking about Lionel Matthews, and also the extraordinary figure of Dr. James Taylor, a civilian doctor who was allowed to continue practicing in Sandakan by the Japanese because they needed a good doctor. He played a central role in the smuggling ring and the underground, as it was called. And he was beaten senseless by the Japanese and always resisted. In fact, his wife was, the ultimate cruelty was his wife, Celia, was brought into the prison and made to look at her bleeding husband and said, "Will you now talk?" She held her tongue as well. And, they basically infuriated the Japanese through their resilience.
I mean, those stories, it made me feel the book was very personal to read and very inspiring, and brought it to life. And I guess that sort of segues me into the incredible detail and research that's obviously gone into writing this book. And a lot of facts that are, not only confronting to read, I imagine they were confronting to research. How did you cope with sort of sifting through all this information and writing about these events?
Well, as you know, I write some pretty harrowing books which are about the 20th century and human conflict. And I must say, I have never experienced such a shuddering sense of revulsion as I've been writing some of the stories in this book, because it is direct cruelty between two men often in some sort of sodden rainforest in the middle of Borneo, where the guy is dropping to his knees from sheer exhaustion and then being clubbed to death by the Japanese guards or Formosan guards coming up the rear. This went on and on, and I found it extremely difficult at times. You have to take long walks in the park. Right. You have to reassess what am I doing here? What am I writing here? Who is this for? And I found myself often writing in the margins, just scribbling on a pad, or just tapping into the page some notes to self, some sort of little notes of encouragement of self, to keep me going. And I just put one at near the end of the book, just so that readers can see. If you don't mind me just reading just briefly. I mean, I won't read the whole thing, but what happened here in Borneo seems at times beyond the imagination of human beings, outside the acceptable remit even of the realm of fiction. For who among our novelists would dare to subject the world to a story that ends with the image of sick and starving men being clubbed, shot and bayoneted to death? The measureless, awful reality that descends on these blokes is near impossible to put down at times, but I must persevere for the sake of historic truth and in the hope of conferring some sense of justice on behalf of the victims of one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Wow. I mean, it's paraphrased, but these things are sustaining for a writer of history of this sort.
When I finished reading Sandakan, I felt really privileged that I'd read an episode of World War II that I didn't know about, and a piece of Australian history that I felt is very important, and hopefully a lot of readers will discover it for the first time. What do you hope that readers will take away from reading your book?
Well, I certainly hope that they will take away a sense of what happened here and the truth about the Sandakan Death Marches. I certainly hope that the reading public and the world at large, if they were to come across this book, that this should never happen again, that this is an outrage against everything we hold dear as human beings, that this is not explained away by these sort of truisms, these relative moral positions that all sides commit atrocities, and that it was total war, it was a racial war, it was the way that the Japanese often explain away what they did, that others did the same. Well, this is just not good enough. We did not slowly exterminate Japanese prisoners of war. This didn't happen. Yeah. They were treated. The death rate in Allied prisons was very, very low. This was an effort to exterminate all the prisoners in this camp, and that was an official policy throughout the Japanese Empire. And this has to be acknowledged historically and morally.
Thank you very much, Paul. You can find Sandakan in stores now. If you love history, particularly Australian history, and you love great writing, I highly recommend Sandakan. You can also go to the website now to download a sample chapter, and Paul will be touring the country, and no doubt you will hear about Sandakan on the radio and TV, and hopefully in your newspaper. So thank you once again for joining in Random Book Talk. See you next time.